We've discussed brush fall off already, but I remember getting started that it was difficult to correlate what's happening in the icon with what's happening in the stroke. So I want to explain that kind of once and for all to hopefully clear up any mysteries around that. We know that there's a list of presets that we can choose from, but if we choose custom, we also get several presets and a bigger graph that we can edit to be whatever we want. So with the standard smooth curve, I'm going to change my stroke method to drag dot, make it full strength, and then click. And now orient the viewport in a specific way. And finally drag a square around this shape. And when we look at the fall off curve, hopefully now you can see the correlation, what's happening. And they serve as profiles of your stroke. So if we go to the sharper curve preset and hold Control, we're inverting it, and that's how we get a sharp point down at the center. If we change the stroke back to space and it duplicates that path, that's how we get a crease type pattern. Now I mentioned that we can make this whatever we want, so we can get creative and edit this graph so that, let's make these points vector handles so that they're sharp. Add several of these. And then I'll make the stroke anchored. And now we get these sort of sci-fi looking connectors that if we make a bunch of them, it starts to look almost like a depth bomb, in like war movies when they put these underwater for the submarines to hit them. But all that just from the type of curve that we create. So like most things in Blender, highly functional in the right circumstance. Also, we've talked about symmetry already, as we can choose with the X, Y, and Z buttons up here, but kind of hidden inside the related settings, we have lock and tiling. So lock is actually really useful. If I hide the sphere and create a monkey head real quick with Shift A, Mesh Monkey Head, I'm going to upres it, Control 5, and go to the Object menu, Convert to Mesh. So now I have a very high resolution monkey head, jump to sculpt mode. And with the lock settings, I find that they come in handy whenever I've sculpted something like a face or a creature to a level that I like the shape but just need to reproportion it a little bit. Like for example, if the eye shape I like, but I want to move it backward in the head, let's turn on X symmetry. And then from an angle down below that makes sense, move the eye backward. If I actually look from the front and undo that stroke, you can see that the eyelid moves down a little bit. And so if I want to move that back and maintain the shape, I can enable the Z axis to prevent it from going up and down, also the X axis to prevent it from going left and right. And now no matter how I stroke on the surface, it's only going to move front and back. And so that's how I can easily move an eye shape backward. Also, I find that it can come in handy whenever I'm sculpting a deep crevice, for example. So let's turn off X symmetry here and disable lock in the X and Z. And now if I hold Control to cut a deep crease, let me increase the strength of that first. So I've got a nice deep crease, and typically I want it to be tighter. So I'll use the P pinch brush to pinch that together. The problem is we lose the depth because the pinch draws it closer together in every axis. If I undo that and lock in the Z axis, also keep in mind this only makes sense because the depth of my crease is oriented up and down. Whenever I pinch, I maintain the same depth, but the surfaces do get closer together. Adding the inflate also brings those surfaces together, all while maintaining the same depth. So that's another example of lock and how it can be useful. We also have tile settings, which I will use the plane for this. Jump into sculpt mode and enabling tile in X and Y. You'll see that we get multiple cursors, or the little dot that's part of your sculpt stroke. And when we make strokes on the surface, let's increase the strength. We're going to be duplicating our pattern according to the tile offset. So if we want the pattern to be closer together, let me undo those strokes. If we want the pattern to be like 0.5, now you see we have more of those cursors, and we can start to sculpt a pattern that is tiled, meaning there's no seams. And so if you wanted to sculpt like a decorative golden inlay pattern or something like that, I can see this being useful for baking to a texture map then. Or if it was a rocky pattern, sculpting a custom rock texture that's tileable, this would be a great option for that, using the sculpt tool to kind of plane away the surface as I quickly try to convert this into a more rocky structure. But I think you get the idea. And keep in mind that we are using a pretty high-res mesh. Also, duplicating the stroke several times makes for a fairly slow sculpting experience. But very specialized use case, but still worth knowing about. Let's turn off tiling. And the last thing I wanted to go over is Matcaps. So I'm pretty sure it's thanks to ZBrush, Matcaps and digital sculpting go together like peanut butter and jelly. You can access this in the solid shading options by clicking the Matcap instead of studio or flat. And here you can choose from several presets. And what Matcaps are good for is quickly and efficiently approximating lighting conditions or shading conditions. So if we click this green one, for example, it seems to be shinier and also like a light source is coming from the upper right corner. Even though there is no actual light or actual shading, it's all a visual illusion. You can very quickly get a different feel of your sculpture and even sculpt with the Matcap according to your preference, really. So in my experience, Matcaps are like 80% does it look cool, and the other 20% is for utility. Like if I'm sculpting a car, I would want to enable the car paint like Matcap, because that will be a closer representation to what the final car would be rendered as. And in this case, it's extremely shiny. And so it would point out any dents or dings, unsmooth surfaces that I want to smooth out. So there is a utility to it. And very specifically, a couple of them are only for utility purposes, like these stripes, where it can kind of visualize the detail level within the sculpture. If I take this great brush, make it really strong and smooth an area out, you can see that perfectly flat areas end up a solid color, where high frequency detail has a lot of the lines. So this is how you can kind of diagnose the level of detail in your sculpture. But most of the time, it's just for looks. The only warning that I received when I was learning about digital sculpting and Matcaps is to not over trust the Matcaps. Remember, you're going to be rendering with actual lighting, actual shading. So this is just an approximation. And sometimes if you lean too heavily on a Matcap, you can end up disappointed that your final render doesn't look as detailed or quite the same. So I remember this specifically when I was sculpting faces early on, and the poor detail looked great on a certain Matcap, but then when I rendered it, the poor detail didn't look the same. And that's about it. The last thing that we'll go over in the next couple videos is the different types of tessellation offered in sculpt mode.